Midnight. A woman alone at a pine table, mending her daughter's dress by a dying lamp when something heavy collapses against her front door. Not a knock. A thud. The sound of a man arriving at the last place he will ever reach. She pulls him inside, lays him on her kitchen table, and goes to work in the dark. Because the lamp runs out of oil and there is simply no time. Her hands move from memory. They find the wound. They close it. And then, in the pitch black, her fingertips brush something else, something they recognize the way you recognize a voice you haven't heard in 15 years. A scar, a specific, impossible scar, one she put there herself, on a battlefield, on a nameless boy, the night she made the most agonizing choice of her life. The past has just bled out onto her floor, and it is only the beginning. If this story reached all the way down and moved something in you, drop a comment and tell me the moment that broke you open.
The wind didn't howl in Mercy's Crossing. It scraped, like sandpaper, against dry bone. It was November of 1878, midnight. Most folks in town were dead to the world, tucked under heavy wool blankets. Not Abigail Thatcher. Abby sat at her pine kitchen table, a needle threaded between her calloused fingers, quietly mending a tear in her daughter S. cotton dress. The oil lamp flickered. The wick was burning low. Then came the sound. It wasn't a knock. It was a heavy, wet thud, like a sack of grain being dropped right against the front door. Abby froze. She didn't reach for the Winchester rifle, resting above the hearth. She reached for the iron latch. 15 years as a battlefield nurse had taught her the difference between a man coming to kill and a man coming to die. This one was dying. She pulled the door open. A shadow fell inward, collapsing onto the floorboards with a heavy groan. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, dusted in trail dirt, and soaked in something much darker. His left hand was clamped tight over his chest, blood seeping through his fingers, pooling on Abby's clean braided rug. He looked up. His eyes were pale, blown wide with shock, but the jaw beneath his rough beard was clenched tight. "Don't," he rasped, his voice sounding like cracked leather. "Don't call the law." Abby didn't ask his name. She didn't ask who he was running from, or what he had done to deserve the hole in his chest. A badge, an outlaw's mask, a preacher's collar, none of it mattered when a heart was pumping its last drops onto the floor. "Get up," she ordered, her voice low and steady. She hooked her arms under his armpits. "Help me, or you die right here. Your choice." He gritted his teeth and pushed. Together, in a clumsy, desperate waltz, they made it to the kitchen table. He spilled onto the hard pine. "Mama?" Abby glanced over her shoulder. Lucy stood in the hallway, clutching a quilt around her shoulders. The 14-year-old S. eyes darted from the stranger to the blood on her mother S. hands. "Boil water, Lucy." "Now," Abby said, not missing a beat. Lucy hesitated, looking at the heavy revolver strapped to the stranger's hip. "Is he a bad man, Mama?" Abby ripped the man's blood-soaked shirt open. She pressed a clean towel hard against the wound to staunch the flow. He let out a muffled roar and passed out cold, his head rolled to the side. Abby looked at her daughter. Her tone was sharp, but grounded in a truth she had carried since the war. A man's worth ain't measured by the iron on his hip or the bounty on his head, Lucy. Blood runs the same color in a saint as it does in a sinner. Bleeding makes us all equal, and a healer doesn't get to choose who deserves a tomorrow. Now, get the water. Lucy nodded, her fear dissolving into purpose. She ran to the stove. Abby turned back to the man. The wound was ugly. It wasn't a bullet hole. It was a clean, deep slice. A knife, close range. Just as she reached for her medical kit, the oil lamp sputtered. The flame danced wildly for a second, then died out completely. The room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the faint, glowing embers in the hearth. "Mama," The lamp, Abby said. There's no time to fill it. She didn't need the light. Her hands remembered. They remembered the suffocating dark of the medical tents at Cold Harbor. They remembered how to navigate torn flesh and broken vessels purely by touch. She took a deep breath, letting the rhythm of her own heartbeat steady her hands. She threaded a clean needle. In the pitch black, her fingers went to work. She felt for the edges of the wound. She pressed down to find the deepest point of the tear. But as her fingertips slid across the hard muscle of his left chest, just beneath the fresh, sticky blood, they snagged on something else. She stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a scar, an old one, massive, jagged, and raised. Abby traced the ridge of it with her thumb. It ran diagonally, a thick cross-stitch pattern, bridging the collarbone down to the fourth rib. It was a crude, desperate piece of needlework. The kind done by someone who didn't have enough time, enough light, or enough thread. A chill crawled up Abby's spine. It had nothing to do with the draft coming through the door. She knew this scar. She knew the exact angle of it. She knew the tension of the knots. She knew it because her hands had tied them. Abby sat completely still in the dark kitchen. The man on the table was a ghost she had stitched back together 15 years ago on a night just as black as this one. She didn't know his name then. She didn't know it now. But as she lowered her needle to close the fresh wound right over the old one, Abby realized something. The past wasn't dead. It had just ridden up to her front door, bleeding. The sun came up hard. It usually did in Texas. It didn't ease into the room. It cut through the window glass like a hot blade, bright and unforgiving. Silas Lockwood woke up with a gasp. His eyes snapped open. His right hand twitched, slapping against his right hip. Empty. His holster was gone. His revolver was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest, followed immediately by a wave of blinding pain. He groaned, his head falling back against a feather pillow. "I put your iron in the lockbox," a voice said. Silas turned his head. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. A woman stood by the cast iron stove. She was pouring coffee into a tin cup. She didn't look at him right away. She just kept pouring. She wore a faded blue dress, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her hair was pinned back, though a few stray strands framed a face that had seen its share of harsh winters and dry summers. "You move too fast, you'll tear the thread," she said. She walked over, setting the steaming cup on a small wooden table near the cot. "And I don't intend to sew you up twice." Silas stared at her. He took inventory of the room, small, clean, smelled like lye soap, boiling coffee, and iodine. He looked down at himself. His shirt was gone. His chest was tightly bound in clean white cotton strips. The pain was localized, a deep, throbbing ache right over his ribs. "Where am I?" his voice cracked. It sounded like boots on dry gravel. "Mercy's Crossing," she said. "My name is Abigail Thatcher. Folks call me Abby." Silas didn't offer his name. He just gritted his teeth and tried to sit up. The room spun. He fell back down, breathless. "I told you," Abby said. Her voice wasn't mean, but it wasn't soft either. It was just a fact. "You're not going anywhere. Not today. Probably not tomorrow." She pulled up a wooden chair and sat down beside the cot. She didn't hover. She didn't wring her hands. She just looked at him with steady, dark eyes. "I need to check the dressing," she said. She didn't reach for him. She kept her hands in her lap. "May I?" Silas looked at her hands. They were clean, the nails clipped short. Strong hands. He gave a short, tight nod. Abby leaned forward. Her touch was professional, detached, but incredibly gentle. She unpinned the cloth and peeled back the first layer of cotton. She examined the angry red line of the wound. Silas watched her face. He waited for the questions. He waited for her to ask if the law was chasing him. He waited for the judgment. It never came. "It's not a bullet hole," Abby said quietly. She didn't look up at his face. She kept her eyes on the work. "Bullet tears through. Leaves a mess. This is clean. Slipped right between the ribs. Missed the lung by a fraction of an inch." She paused. "It's a knife wound. Up close." Silas swallowed hard. The memory flashed behind his eyes. The campfire, the sudden movement, the cold steel sliding into his flesh, the face of the man holding the handle. "Yeah?" Silas rasped. "It was a knife. Your enemy got lucky," Abby noted, reaching for a jar of salve. "Wasn't an enemy," Silas said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "The man who drove the blade in was the man I trusted most in this world." Abby stopped. Her hand hovered over his chest. For a second, the air in the room felt terribly heavy. She didn't offer pity. Pity was cheap. She just nodded slowly, scooped out a bit of the salve, and carefully applied it to the edges of the wound. "Betrayal cuts deeper than the steel does," she said softly. Silas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way she worked, the absolute confidence in her fingers, the neat, precise row of black stitches holding his skin together. "You did this?" he asked, gesturing weakly to his chest. "I did. In the dark?" "Lamp ran out of oil. Didn't have time to refill it," Silas frowned. His mind was clearing, the fog of blood loss lifting just enough to let the ingrained prejudices of his time seep in. "You're a woman." Abby paused her rapping. She looked him dead in the eye. "I am," she said. "You stitch like a field surgeon, like a doctor. But women ain't doctors." Abby didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the quiet, crushing weight of a woman who had fought this battle 1,000 times. "Listen to me, mister," she said, her tone rhythmic and hard. "Shrapnel doesn't care if you're a man or a woman when it tears through flesh. A fever doesn't ask your gender before it boils your blood. And medicine shouldn't care about the gender of the one holding the scalpel." She tied off the bandage with a sharp, definitive pull. "I spent 2 years in the mud at Cold Harbor," she continued, leaning back in her chair. "I put boys younger than you back together while shells rained down on our tents. My competence isn't dictated by the skirt I wear. It's dictated by the fact that you re-breathing right now, instead of rotting on my porch." Silas stared at her. He felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. It was a rare feeling for him. He had spent his life in saloons and cattle camps, surrounded by men who measured worth by the size of a man's shoulders. "I didn't mean any disrespect, ma'am," he said quietly, and he meant it. "Respect isn't a word you say, mister. It's a way you act," Abby replied. She picked up the tin cup of coffee and handed it to him. "Drink. You need the fluids." Silas took the cup. Their fingers brushed. Hers were warm. Just then, the door to the kitchen pushed open. The young girl from the night before walked in. She was carrying a plate with 2 thick slices of cornbread. She stopped at the foot of the cot, staring at Silas with wide, curious eyes. "This is Lucy," Abby said. "My daughter." Silas nodded at the girl. "Much obliged for the kitchen table last night, Lucy." Lucy didn't smile, but she didn't hide behind her mother either. "Are you a bad man?" she asked flatly. Silas let out a dry, rattling chuckle. It hurt his chest. "I reckon that depends on who you ask, little bird. But I ain't here to bring trouble to your door. Trouble usually doesn't ask permission before it knocks," Abby said. She took the plate from Lucy and set it next to the coffee. "Eat. Rest. We'll see if you catch a fever by sundown." Abby turned and walked toward the door, her hand resting gently on Lucy's shoulder, guiding the girl out of the room. Silas watched them go. He took a sip of the bitter, black coffee. It burned on the way down, and he welcomed the pain. It proved he was alive. He looked down at the fresh white bandages on his chest. Beneath them, hidden from sight, was the old scar, the one he had carried for 15 years. He wondered if she had felt it in the dark. He wondered if she knew. He closed his eyes. The coffee warmed his stomach, but a cold dread settled in his bones. Harlan Vance would realize he wasn't dead. Vance's men would track the blood. It was only a matter of time. And now, Silas realized, he had anchored himself to a woman and a child. He was putting them in the crosshairs. A good man would leave. He would get up, saddle his horse, and ride out to die in the dirt alone. But Silas couldn't stand, and deep down, looking at the empty doorway where Abigail Thatcher had just stood, he realized a terrifying truth. He didn't want to leave. The coat weighed a ton. Abby had hauled it out to the back porch. It was made of heavy canvas and lined with wool. It was stiff with dried mud, horse sweat, and a terrifying amount of Silas blood. It was mid-afternoon. The Texas wind was blowing dust across the yard. Abby rolled up her sleeves and plunged the coat into a galvanized tin tub filled with cold water and lye soap. She scrubbed the fabric against the washboard. It was hard, rhythmic work. Up and down. Scrub and rinse. She wasn't just washing a coat. She was working out her anxiety. The man inside her house was dangerous. She knew that much. You didn't get a knife in the chest from your best friend because you were living a quiet, righteous life. But she had seen the exhaustion in his eyes. She had seen the way he spoke to Lucy. Not like a nuisance, but like a person. As she wrung out the heavy fabric of the coat's left side, her fingers caught on something hard. She stopped. She ran her thumb over the inner lining near the chest pocket. There was a lump, flat, heavy, and metallic. It wasn't a pocket watch. It was sewn directly into the lining. Hidden. Abby dried her hands on her apron. She walked into the kitchen, grabbed a small seam ripper from her sewing basket, and walked back out to the porch. She laid the wet coat on a wooden bench. Carefully, deliberately, she picked at the heavy stitches of the lining. One thread. Two. The fabric parted. She reached inside. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She pulled it out. It was a badge, a silver star set inside a shield. The metal was tarnished, the edges worn smooth from years of riding in a pocket or pinned to a chest. Above the star, etched in bold letters, read Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Abby's breath hitched. A Pinkerton. The agency had a reputation. Sometimes they were the law when the law wouldn't ride out far enough. But more often than not, lately they were hired guns for the railroad syndicates, thugs with a badge. But it wasn't the name that made the blood freeze in Abby's veins. It was the bottom of the shield. Stamped into the silver, right below the star, were 3 numbers. Unit 42. The washboard slipped from her mind. The wind stopped howling. The world shrunk down to that piece of silver in her palm. Unit 42. 7 years ago. A dusty road just outside of Abilene. Her husband, Nathan, riding back from the assayer's office. He had a piece of paper in his pocket, the deed to their land. Land he had refused to sell to the Continental Railroad. Land he swore he would die on before he let a steel track cut it in half. They found Nathan with 3 bullets in his back. The sheriff said it was bandits. But a week later, a drifter came through town. The drifter had been hiding in the brush. He saw the riders. He saw the leader walk up to Nathan's body, pull back his duster, and flash a silver badge to the others. The drifter had a sharp eye. He saw the numbers stamped on the bottom. Unit 42. Abby stood on the porch, staring at the badge. Her hands began to shake, not from fear, from a rage so deep, so old, it felt like it might tear her apart from the inside out. The man sleeping in her spare room. The man whose life she had saved with her own 2 hands in the dark. He was one of them. He was a piece of the machine that had murdered her husband. Abby didn't scream. She didn't cry. The time for tears had passed 7 years ago. She turned on her heel, the badge clutched tight in her fist, and walked back into the house. Silas was awake. He was sitting up slightly, propped against the pillows, staring out the small window at the rolling plains. When Abby walked in, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He felt it instantly. He looked at her. He saw the rigid set of her jaw. He saw her closed fist. "What's wrong?" he asked. Abby walked to the foot of the bed. She didn't say a word. She just opened her hand and tossed the heavy silver badge onto the wool blanket covering his legs. It landed with a dull thud. Silas looked at the badge. Then he looked at Abby. The color drained from his face. "You went through my coat," he stated. "I was washing your blood out of it," Abby replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "I found a secret instead." Silas didn't reach for the badge. He just let it sit there. "You're a Pinkerton," she said. "I was. Unit 42. Silas' eyes flickered. He heard the shift in her tone. He heard the specific venom attached to those numbers. "How do you know that unit?" "7 years ago," Abby said, taking a step closer to the bed. Her voice was rhythmic, relentless, like a hammer driving a nail. "A man named Nathan Thatcher owned 500 acres of prime cattle land near Abilene. The Continental Railroad wanted it. He said no, so they sent men to change his mind. They didn't use words, they used lead." Silas stopped breathing. "They shot him in the back," Abby continued, "and the man who did it wore that exact badge." "Unit 42. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the iron footboard of the bed. "So, I'm going to ask you one question, mister. And you better pray your answer is the truth. Did you kill my husband?" Silas met her gaze. He didn't look away. "No," he said. His voice was steady, solid. "I didn't." Abby searched his eyes. She looked for the lie. She had seen enough men lie to save their own skins. But Silas' eyes held nothing but a tired, heavy sorrow. "But you know who did," she said. "It wasn't a question. I do." Abby gripped the iron footboard harder. Her knuckles turned white. "And you rode with them?" "I rode with them," Silas admitted. He slowly reached down and picked up the badge. He looked at it with absolute disgust. "For 5 years, I thought we were the law. I thought we were bringing order to the frontier. But things changed. The agency took contracts from the railroads. We stopped chasing outlaws and started becoming them." He looked back at Abby. "They call it paving the way for civilization," Silas said, his voice rising, thick with anger. "But civilization isn't built on stripping defenseless farmers of their land. It ain't built on shooting men in the back for protecting what's theirs. The right to live on your own land cannot be bought with blood." When I figured out what Unit 42 was really doing, I walked away. "You walked away," Abby repeated, her voice dripping with bitterness. "You didn't stop them." Silas looked down at his hands. "I didn't. I was a coward. I turned in my badge and I ran." He tossed the badge onto the floor. It clattered against the wooden planks. "The man who put this knife in my chest," Silas continued, gesturing to his bandages. "His name is Harlan Vance. He used to be my captain in Unit 42. He's working for the railroad again. Clearing land, taking what isn't his. I found out he was heading this way, toward Mercy S. Crossing." Abby froze. "He's coming here?" "He's coming for this town, for your land." Silas looked up at her, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "I tracked him. I was going to put a bullet in him before he could do to someone else what he did to your husband. But he found me first. He put a knife in me and left me for dead. Abby stood in silence. The revelation washed over her, confusing her rage. This man hadn't pulled the trigger on her husband, but he had worn the same coat. He had eaten at the same fires as the men who did. Yet, here he was, bleeding out in her spare room because he had finally tried to stop them. Silas didn't try to defend himself further. He respected her grief. He respected her right to hate him. I understand if you want me out, Silas said quietly. He grabbed the edge of the blanket, preparing to push himself up, even though they both knew it would rip his stitches wide open. You saved my life. I won't bring Harlan Vance's wrath down on your roof. Abby looked at the man, struggling to move. She looked at the blood already blooming faintly pink against the fresh white bandages. She remembered Nathan. She remembered the helplessness of burying him. Stop, Abby commanded. Silas paused, looking at her. Abby walked around the bed. She bent down, picked up the silver badge from the floor, and set it on the nightstand. I don't forgive you for running 7 years ago, Abby said, her voice hard but clear. But my husband is dead. Letting you bleed to death on my porch won't bring him back. And if Harlan Vance is coming to take this town, she looked down at Silas, then we are going to need every gun we can get. She turned and walked to the door. She stopped in the frame, looking back over her shoulder. You rest, Silas Lockwood, because when you can stand, you have a debt to pay. She stepped out, closing the door softly behind her. Silas lay back against the pillows. He let out a long, shaky breath. She knew. She knew the worst part of his past, and she hadn't cast him out. For the first time in 7 years, Silas felt a strange, terrifying sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with a knife wound. It felt like hope. 3 days passed. The fever never came. Silas Lockwood was tough, but the woman who stitched him was tougher. By the 4th morning, Silas could walk from the cot to the kitchen window without his vision swimming. The pain was still there. A hot, tight pull across his ribs every time he drew a breath. But it was a clean pain, the kind that meant the body was knitting itself back together, not rotting away. He stood by the glass. He watched the yard Mercy's Crossing wasn't much to look at. A dusty main street, a general store, a saloon that leaned a little to the left. But it was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant folks minded their own business, except when they bled. A buckboard wagon rolled into Abby's front yard. The horses were lathered. A man jumped down, holding a bloody rag to his forearm. Silas stepped back into the shadows of the kitchen. He kept his hand near the heavy iron skillet on the stove. He didn't have his gun. Abby came out the front door. She didn't panic. She didn't ask the man what he did. She just pointed to the wooden bench on the porch. Sit, Eli, she called out. Her voice carried through the open window. Clear. In charge. Another man rode up on a sorrel gelding. He wore a tin star on his vest. Sheriff Amos Gentry. He was an older man. Gray hair, thick mustache, eyes that had seen too many winters. He dismounted slowly, favoring his left knee. Mornin', Abby, the sheriff said. He touched the brim of his hat. Amos, she nodded. She was already unwrapping Eli's arm. It was a nasty cut. Axe slipped. Doc Josiah is sleeping it off again, Amos said. He didn't sound angry, just tired. Saw Eli riding like the devil was chasing him. Figured he'd end up on your porch. Doc's hands shake before noon, Abby said flatly. She reached into her apron, pulled out a small brown bottle, and poured it directly over Eli's cut. The man hissed through his teeth. Hold still, she ordered. Silas watched from the window. In any other town, A woman practicing medicine openly would be run out, or worse. The medical boards back east wouldn't let a woman in the door. They said a female constitution was too fragile for the sight of blood. They said a woman's mind couldn't grasp the science. Abby Thatcher threaded a needle with the casual grace of a woman knitting a sock. She took hold of the torn flesh. She stitched the farmhand's arm with brutal efficiency. Amos Gentry stood by. He didn't look squeamish. He looked relieved. "You do good work, Abby," Amos said quietly. "Better than Josiah ever did, even sober." "Tell that to the state board," she replied, snipping the thread. "I don't care about the state board. I care about this town." Amos shifted his weight. He looked at the front door. Then he looked right at the window where Silas was standing. Silas froze. The old lawman had sharp eyes. "Here you had some excitement a few nights back," Amos said. His voice dropped an octave. "Casual, too casual. Saw some blood in the dirt by your gate. Looked heavy." Abby didn't miss a beat. She finished tying off Eli's bandage. "Coyote got into the chickens. Had to shoot it. Coyote. Coyote." Amos repeated. "Must have been a big one." "It was." Amos nodded slowly. "You know, Abby, if a stray dog wanders into your yard, sometimes it is best not to feed it. Strays bring fleas. Sometimes they bring wolves. I can handle wolves, Amos. I've got a rifle." "I know you do." Amos touched his hat again. "You let me know if that coyote comes back." He mounted his horse and rode off. Eli thanked Abby, left a basket of fresh eggs on the porch, and drove his wagon away. Silas stepped away from the window. He sat down at the pine table. A moment later, Abby walked in. She went straight to the wash basin and began scrubbing the blood off her hands with harsh lye soap. "He knows I'm here," Silas said. "Amos isn't a fool," Abby replied, drying her hands. "But he's practical. He knows I keep this town breathing. He won't push my door open unless he has to." Silas watched her. She was exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes. Between running the homestead, raising a child, and patching up half the county, she was carrying the weight of 3 men. Silas stood up. His ribs screamed. He ignored them. He walked over to the stove. A basket of potatoes sat on the floor, a pile of carrots next to it. He picked up a small paring knife. He grabbed a potato. He started peeling. Abby stopped. The towel dropped from her hands. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Peeling," Silas said. The knife moved smoothly in his right hand. The peel fell away in a long, unbroken ribbon. "You saved my life. I'm eating your food. I ain't going to sit around while you do all the work." Abby stared at him. It was a strange sight. A 6'2" Pinkerton detective, a man with a knife wound and a violent past, standing in her kitchen, doing the prep work for dinner. In her experience, men didn't do this. Men chopped the wood. Men shot the meat. But the kitchen was woman's work. It was beneath them. Nathan had been a good man, a loving husband, but he would never have picked up a potato peeler. Silas didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look like his pride was wounded. He just looked at the potato. "I can chop wood too," Silas offered. "One-handed. Won't be pretty, but it'll burn." "You'll tear your stitches," Abby warned, but the hard edge in her voice softened. "Just a fraction. Then I'll just peel." Abby watched him for another long moment. She didn't say thank you. She didn't make a fuss. She simply walked over, picked up a knife of her own, and grabbed a carrot. They stood side by side in the quiet kitchen. The only sound was the scrape of the blades. It was a small thing, a pile of vegetables. But in that quiet, sunlit kitchen, a line was crossed. There was no master and servant. There was no male pride or female duty. There were just 2 people, surviving. Silas looked over at her. He saw the strength in her profile, He saw the quiet dignity in the way she held herself. He was a hunted man. He brought danger with every breath he took. But standing there, doing the simplest chore in the world, Silas Lockwood felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He felt like he belonged. Dinner was a quiet affair. Beef stew, fresh bread. The lantern swung gently from the ceiling beam, casting warm, golden light across the table. For an hour, the war outside didn't exist. There were no railroads, no Pinkertons, just the clink of spoons against porcelain bowls. Silas sat across from Lucy. The girl was observant. She had her mother's sharp eyes. She hadn't spoken much to him over the past few days, usually just hovering in doorways, watching him heal. But tonight, she seemed to have decided he wasn't a monster. "Do you have a horse?" Lucy asked suddenly. Silas paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "I did. A big bay gelding. Named him Copper. I reckon he's halfway to Mexico by now. He spooked when the trouble started." "I have a horse," Lucy stated proudly. "A Mustang. Mama caught him and broke him herself. His name is Wind." Silas raised an eyebrow. He looked at Abby. "You broke a Mustang?" "I have patience," Abby said simply, tearing off a piece of bread. "Mustangs don't respond to the whip. They respond to trust. You show them you won't hurt them, they'll let you put a saddle on." "Men aren't much different," Silas chuckled. It was a low, genuine sound. "I reckon you're right about that." He looked back at Lucy. "Where'd you learn about horses, Lucy? You born out here?" Lucy shook her head, her bright eyes dimmed just a fraction. "No, I was born up north, near Abilene. We had a farm." Silas nodded slowly. "Abilene, tough country. Your folks still up there?" The room went still. Abby stopped chewing. Abby stopped chewing. She looked up, her eyes flashing a warning at Silas. The question was out. "No," Lucy said quietly. She looked down at her stew. "They died. In a fire, a long time ago. I was real little." "I'm sorry, kid," Silas said softly. "That's a hard hand to be dealt." "Mama took me in," Lucy continued, looking back up at Abby with fierce loyalty. "She's my real mama now." "She is," Silas agreed. He took another bite of stew. His detective instincts, dormant for days, began to twitch. A fire near Abilene. Around the time the railroad was pushing through. "What was your daddy's name, Lucy?" "Maybe. I heard of him." "Arthur," the girl said. "Arthur Vance." The spoon slipped from Silas's fingers. It clattered loudly against the rim of the bowl, splashing brown broth onto the clean pine table. Silas stopped breathing. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. The golden light of the lantern seemed to turn cold. He stared at the 14-year-old girl sitting across from him. He looked at her hair. He looked at the shape of her jaw. Vance. Abilene. A fire. The memories slammed into him like a runaway train. 7 years ago, Harlan Vance had a son, a boy who hated everything his father stood for. The boy took a bride, moved away, tried to start a quiet life farming dirt outside of Abilene. But Harlan Vance didn't tolerate defection, not even from his own blood. When the boy threatened to go to the federal marshals about the railroad's bloody tactics, Harlan ordered the farm burned to the ground. Silas was in the camp when the order was given. He had heard the whispers. "Burn the rats out," they said. No one survived the fire. But here she was, sitting across from him, eating bread. The biological granddaughter of the most ruthless man in Texas. The man who had put a knife in Silas's chest. The man coming to burn this town to ash. Silas's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed back from the table. His chest heaved. He looked at Abby. Abby's face was made of stone. She knew. She had known all along. "Lucy," Abby said, her voice perfectly level. "Go check on the horses. Make sure the barn door is latched tight." "But I haven't finished now, Lucy." The girl recognized the tone. She didn't argue. She slipped out of her chair, grabbed her shawl, and walked out the back door. The latch clicked shut. Silence swallowed the kitchen. Silas stood up. The pain in his ribs was blinding, but he didn't care. He leaned heavily on the table, staring at Abby. Vance, Silas breathed. The word sounded like a curse. She is Harlan Vance's blood. She is my daughter, Abby said coldly. She didn't move. She remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Abby, do you know who that man is? Do you know what he did to his own son? Silas's voice shook. He burned them alive, Arthur and his wife. He burned them to keep them quiet. I know. Then you know the danger she's in, and the danger she brings. Silas ran a hand over his face. If Harlan Vance finds out that girl survived, if he finds out she's here, he won't. He's coming to this town, Abby. He's going to ride right down that main street. Silas pointed a shaking finger toward the back door. That girl has the wolf's blood in her. Harlan's blood. Abby stood up. The chair screeched against the floor. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She stepped around the table and stood inches from Silas. Her dark eyes were burning with a fierce, absolute fire. Listen to me very carefully, Silas Lockwood, Abby said. Her voice was low, rhythmic, and carried the weight of holy law. Blood does not make the monster. Silas stared at her, breathing hard. No child is born bearing the sins of their fathers, Abby stated, pronouncing every word with deliberate force. Sin is not inherited in the womb. It is taught. It is chosen. Lucy's humanity begins with how she is loved, how she is raised, and what she sees at my table. She poked him hard in the chest, right above his bandage. Silas winced, but didn't back away. She is not Harlan Vance's legacy, Abby continued. She is a child with a fundamental right to safety, to a home, and to a life free from the shadow of a man she doesn't even remember. I chose her. I pulled her from the ashes of that life, and I gave her a new one. Silas looked into Abby's eyes. He saw the immovable force of a mother's love. It was a love that defied biology, defied logic, and defied fear. You think her blood makes her dangerous? Abby asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You wore his badge. You rode with his men. You carried his guns. You have more of Harlan Vance in you than that little girl ever will. The words hit Silas harder than the knife had. He staggered back a step. The truth of it crushed him. She was right. He had chosen the darkness. Lucy was just an innocent caught in the crossfire. Silas stammered. He looked away, ashamed. I'm sorry. You're right. Abby let out a long, slow breath. The anger drained from her posture, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion behind. He's coming, Silas said quietly, looking at the back door where Lucy had gone. And if he recognizes her, he won't kill her. He'll use her. He'll take her, just to own her, just to prove he can. Abby walked over to the hearth. She looked up at the Winchester rifle mounted above the mantel. The firelight played across the polished walnut stock. He can try, Abby said. She turned back to Silas. You said you came here to stop him, she said. Are you going to run again, Silas? Or are you going to stand? Silas looked at the woman. He looked at the home she had built. He thought of the girl in the barn, brushing a wild Mustang because her mother taught her how to build trust instead of breaking spirits. He reached down to his ribs. He felt the thick, tight stitches holding him together. I'm done running, Silas said. His voice was no longer a cracked whisper. It was iron. I'm staying. We hold the line right here. The night air was sharp. It tasted like dust and impending frost. Silas sat on the edge of the front porch. He had his boots on. He was holding Abby's Winchester across his knees. He didn't have the strength to shoulder it properly yet. but he could rack the lever if he had to. He was standing guard, not because Abby asked him to, because he needed to. The front door creaked open behind him. Silas didn't jump. He had heard her footsteps through the floorboards. Light, steady. Abby stepped out onto the porch. She was wrapped in a thick wool shawl. She carried 2 tin cups. Steam rose from them, twisting in the cold air. She walked over and sat down beside him on the wooden steps. She didn't say a word. She just handed him a cup. Obliged, Silas muttered. He took a sip. Tea, bitter and strong. They sat in silence for a long time. The Texas stars were bright, scattered like shattered glass across the black sky. Out here, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of the wind, the dry rustle of sagebrush, the distant yip of a coyote. Silas kept his eyes on the horizon. The road leading into town was an ink-black ribbon. "You should be sleeping," Silas said finally. His voice was low, careful not to break the quiet too sharply. "So should you," Abby replied. She brought her cup to her lips. "Your body needs rest to knit that muscle back together. I'll rest when the dirt covers me." Abby turned her head and looked at him. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face. He looked older than 42. He looked like a man who had carried a heavy stone uphill for a very long time. "Why are you here, Silas?" she asked. Silas paused. "I told you, Vance is coming. I tracked him." "That's why you were on the road," Abby said. Her voice was gentle, but persistent, rhythmic, pushing for the truth. "That's not why you came to my door. You didn't just stumble into Mercy's Crossing by accident. Out of all the towns in Texas to bleed out in, you aimed for this one. Why?" Silas set the tin cup down on the wooden step between his boots. The metal clinked loudly. He stared out at the dark road. He didn't want to say it. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head over the last 7 years. But now, sitting next to her, smelling the lye soap and the tea, the words felt like broken glass in his throat. "Nathan?" Silas said. The name hung in the cold air. Abby stiffened. She didn't look away from him, but her hands tightened around her cup. "What about him?" Silas leaned his elbows on his knees. He looked down at his hands. "I told you I walked away from Unit 42. I told you I quit when I saw what they were becoming. You did. I didn't tell you exactly when." Silas took a slow, agonizing breath. His ribs ached, but the pain in his chest was deeper than the knife wound. "We were camped outside Abilene," Silas began, his voice flat, stripped of emotion, because if he let the emotion in, he wouldn't be able to finish. Harlan Vance was furious. The railroad was pushing hard. They needed the valley clear by the end of the month. One man was holding out, a stubborn farmer with 500 acres. Abby closed her eyes. "Vance gathered the men by the fire," Silas continued. "He handed out the whiskey. He handed out the bonus pay. And he gave the order. Ride out. Make an example. Don't come back until the deed is signed or the man is dead." Silas looked up, his eyes finding Abby's face in the dark. "I heard the order, Abby," Silas said. His voice cracked. "I knew his name, Thatcher. I knew where your farm was." Abby stared at him. The silence on the porch was deafening. "I packed my saddlebags that night," Silas said, the words rushing out now, a desperate confession. "I turned in my badge to Vance. I told him I wouldn't do it. I told him I was done." "You quit," Abby whispered. "I quit," Silas agreed, tears welling in his eyes, stinging in the cold wind. "I rode away, but I rode the wrong way." He raised a shaking hand and pointed a finger to the north. "I rode north, toward the border, away from the trouble, away from Harlan Vance." He dropped his hand, pointing it directly at the dusty road leading into town. "I didn't ride to your farm. I didn't ride ahead to warn him. I knew what they were going to do. I knew the men doing it. I had a 3-hour head start, and I used it to save myself. Silas dropped his head into his hands. His shoulders shook. I didn't pull the trigger, Abby, he sobbed quietly, but my cowardice killed your husband. Abby didn't move. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She sat completely still, absorbing the weight of his confession. She was a woman who dealt in facts. The fact was, this man had known. He could have stopped it. He could have warned Nathan. Nathan could have fought back, or they could have run. He had the power to change her life, and he chose not to use it. That's why I came, Silas said, his voice muffled behind his hands. When I found out Vance was heading here, I couldn't run again. I wanted to find you. I wanted to look you in the eye and tell you the truth. To tell you that I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. He looked at her, expecting the rifle across his knees to be pointed at his chest. Was looking at him. Her eyes were dark pools in the moonlight. You want absolution, Silas? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind like a razor. No, he said honestly. I don't deserve it. Good, because I don't have it to give. Abby stood up. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked down at him. The silence of good men, Abby said. Her words, measured, deliberate, is a hall pass for evil. You stood by the fire. You knew the crime was going to happen. You had the voice to shout, and you chose to whisper. She wasn't yelling. That made it worse. There is a difference between not pulling the trigger and trying to stop the bullet, Abby continued. You didn't do either. You were complicit, and my husband paid the price for your silence. Silas nodded. He accepted the verdict. He deserved every word. I know. But, Abby said, pausing. She took a deep breath. Silas looked up. But you're here now, she said. She pointed a finger at his bandaged chest. You took a knife for this town before you even got here. You peeled my potatoes. You sat at my table with my daughter. Abby's voice lost some of its hard edge. It softened, just a fraction, into the tone of a tired nurse looking at a broken soldier. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry. It rots a man from the inside out. I see what it's done to you. It's all I have left, Silas said. Then put it down, Abby ordered. Silas stared at her, confused. You can't change what you did 7 years ago, Abby said, stepping closer to him. You can't bring Nathan back. But you are sitting on my porch tonight, holding a rifle, waiting for the devil to come up that road. You didn't run this time. She reached down and picked up her empty tin cup. A man's worth isn't decided by his worst mistake, Silas. It's decided by what he does next. She turned and walked to the door. She opened it, the warm yellow light from the kitchen spilling out onto the porch. I don't forgive you for Nathan, she said, looking back at him. I probably never will, but I trust you to hold the line with me tomorrow. She walked inside, but she didn't close the door all the way. She left it cracked open. Just a few inches, letting the warmth bleed out into the cold night, letting him know he wasn't locked out. Silas sat on the porch alone. He looked at the crack of light. He had carried his guilt for 7 years. He had let it define him. He had let it make him a ghost. But Abby Thatcher didn't want a ghost. She wanted a man who would stand and fight. Silas reached down and gripped the Winchester. His hands were steady. He wasn't running anymore. Morning came with a gray, overcast sky, the kind of sky that pressed down on a man's shoulders. Silas was in the yard. He had a hatchet in his right hand. He was splitting kindling. Small, careful chops. It pulled at his ribs, but he needed to move. He needed to feel the wood splintering, something breaking that he could actually control. A rider came up the trail. Slow and steady. Silas stopped. He rested the hatchet on the chopping block. It was an old man on an old mule. The man wore a faded black coat and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with trail dirt. A white collar peeked out from under his woolen scarf. Preacher Elias. The preacher tied his mule to the hitching post. He didn't look at Silas with fear nor with anger. He just looked at him with eyes that had seen 1,000 sinners and 1,000 saints, and knew there wasn't much difference between the two. "Mornin'," Sis said. He kept his hand near his hip. "Peace be with you, son," Elias replied. His voice was gravelly, worn out from years of shouting over the wind. He looked at Silas' bandaged chest beneath his open shirt. "Looks like you. I've already met the devil on the road. Something like that. And you found an angel to put you back together." The front door opened. Abby stepped out. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Elias, you're out early. Trouble rides early." "Abigail," the preacher said, stepping up onto the porch. He took off his hat. "Word is drifting down from Abilene. Railroad men are pushing hard. Harlan Vance's name is on the wind. I came to see if you were packing your wagon." "I'm not going anywhere," Abby said. Elias nodded. He didn't look surprised. He turned his gaze back to Silas. "A man who stays when the fire is coming is either a fool or a man trying to buy back his soul," Elias said quietly. He looked back to Abby. "Or maybe he's just here to help you carry your load. You've carried it alone for too long, child." Abby stiffened. A shadow crossed her face. Silas saw it. It wasn't fear of Harlan Vance. It was something deeper, something older. "I'm fine, Elias," Abby said, her voice tight. "No, you're not," the old man said gently. "I was there, Abigail. I know what you keep locked up in the dark. But a soul wasn't built to hold that much grief. You keep trying to save everyone in this town, to pay a debt you don't owe." He put his hat back on. "Every life weighs the exact same on God's scale," Elias said. His words were slow, heavy with conviction. "The Lord doesn't ask for a man's rank, or his name, or his wealth when he takes him. You made the only choice you could. It's time you forgave yourself." Elias tipped his hat. He walked back to his mule, climbed on, and rode away into the gray morning. Silas stood in the yard. The wind whipped at his open shirt. He looked at Abby. She was gripping the porch rail. Her knuckles were bone white. She wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at nothing. Lost in a place he couldn't see. Silas walked up the steps. He didn't ask what the preacher meant. He just opened the door and waited for her to step inside. The kitchen was warm. The coffee pot was hissing on the stove. Abby walked to the table and sat down. She looked exhausted. The iron spine that had held her up for days seemed to suddenly bend. Silas went to the stove. He grabbed a rag, picked up the hot metal pot, and poured 2 cups of black coffee. He walked over and set one down in front of her. Then he sat across from her. He didn't speak. He just waited. It was a quiet act of respect. He was giving her the exact same space she had given him the night before. No judgment, just a place to set the burden down. Abby stared at the black surface of her coffee. 1864, she whispered. Silas leaned in, resting his forearms on the pine table. Cold Harbor, Virginia, Abby continued. Her voice sounded hollow, empty. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Grant threw thousands of men into the mud. We ran out of cots by noon. We ran out of bandages by sundown. We were tearing our own petticoats to stop the bleeding. She closed her eyes. The memory was a physical weight in the room. Preacher Elias was our chaplain, she said. He gave last rites until his voice gave out. I was the head nurse for the 3rd tent. It was pitch black outside, rain coming down in sheets. We only had 3 oil lamps left. Silas didn't interrupt. He kept his eyes on her face, anchoring her to the present. They brought two men in on stretchers, Abby said. Her breathing grew shallow. Both gut shot, both bleeding out. One was a Union major, older man, mid-50s. The other was a boy, a private. Couldn't have been more than 20. No name tag. Just a kid in a muddy blue coat. She opened her eyes and looked at Silas. The pain in them was agonizing. I only had enough surgical thread for one, she said. The words hung in the air. The surgeon was gone. It was just me, Abby said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I had to choose. Right there, in the dark, two men bleeding on the canvas, and I only held one needle. Tridge, Silas said quietly. He knew the word. He had seen the medical tents. Tridge, Abby nodded bitterly. That's the clinical word for it. It makes it sound scientific. Clean. But there is nothing clean about looking two dying men in the eye and deciding which one gets to see tomorrow. She gripped her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking. I looked at their wounds, Abby said. The major, his was deep. A Minié ball had torn through his side. The boy was stabbed, bayonet or a knife, right through the chest. Nasty, but it missed the lung. Technically, the boy had a better chance of surviving the shock. You went with the better odds, Silas said. That's what you were trained to do. I was trained to save lives, Abby snapped, a sudden fire in her voice. And I let a man die. The major, he was conscious. He looked at me while I was stitching the boy. He didn't scream, he didn't beg. He just reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. A single tear broke loose and tracked down Abby's cheek. It was a letter from his daughter, she whispered. He held it to his chest, and he bled to death on the floor while I saved a nameless boy. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The raw tragedy of it was suffocating. Preacher Elias buried the major the next morning, Abby said. He told me I did the right thing. He told me I followed medical protocol. But protocol doesn't keep you warm at night. Protocol doesn't drown out the sound of a father taking his last breath. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had stitched Silas together. I saved that boy, Abby said. He lived. They shipped him out the next week. I never knew his name. I never saw his face in the light. But I traded a father's life for his. And every day since then, I wonder, what did that boy do with the life I bought for him? Was it worth the price? She let out a ragged breath. The confession was over. Silas sat perfectly still. The implicit lesson of the moment echoed in the silence between them. Society placed men on pedestals and women in kitchens. But in the mud of Cold Harbor, this woman had held the power of God in her hands. She had borne the absolute crushing weight of human equality, the terrible truth that all blood runs red, and all lives have the exact same value. Silas reached across the table. He didn't grab her hand. He didn't force a touch. He simply laid his large, calloused hand on the pine board, palm up. An invitation. Abby looked at his hand. Then, slowly, she reached out and rested her fingers lightly against his palm. Abby, Silas said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly what guilt felt like. You didn't play God in that tent. You played the impossible hand the devil dealt you. I let a man die, she repeated, the guilt ingrained in her bones. No, Silas said firmly. The war killed that major. The men who started the war killed him. You saved a life. You took the only victory you could in a room full of defeat. He squeezed her fingers gently. You think a man's life is worth more because he's a father? Silas asked, leaning closer. You think a life is worth less because it has a nameless boy? You said it yourself a few nights ago. Blood runs the same color. You made a choice based on who could survive. That's not a sin, Abigail. That's mercy. Abby stared at him. The ridge had walls around her heart for 15 years began to crack. I've seen men kill for $1, Silas continued, his voice thick with emotion. I've seen men burn farms to lay a track of steel. That is sin. What you did, you stood in the dark, covered in blood, and you refused to let the darkness have both of them. He let go of her hand and sat back. You asked yourself if that boy's life was worth the price, Silas said. I can't answer that, but I can tell you this. The woman who made that choice, the woman who carried that ghost all these years, she says the only reason I am breathing right now. She says the only reason this town stands a chance. Abby wiped her cheek. She took a deep, shuddering breath. For the first time in a decade and a half, the weight on her chest felt a fraction lighter. Not gone, but shared. Silas Lockwood was a broken man, but in his brokenness, he understood hers. They were two people forged in the fires of impossible choices. He had chosen silence and lived with the shame. She had chosen action and lived with the guilt. Thank you, Abby said softly. Silas just nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. Drink your coffee. Abby, he said, looking toward the front window. The gray sky was getting darker. The wind was picking up. Harlan Vance is coming, and he won't care about our ghosts. He's only bringing new ones. Abby picked up her cup. Her hands had stopped shaking. She had confessed her deepest shame, and the man sitting across from her hadn't run. He hadn't judged. He had simply held the lantern steady so she could find her way out of the dark. Let him come, Abby said. Her voice was iron once again. Silas smiled. A grim, hard smile. He checked the action on the Winchester, resting against his chair. The past was finally out in the open. Now, there was only the future left to fight for. The dust arrived before the riders did. A thick, yellow cloud rolling down the north road, choking the midday sun. Silas was in the barn. He was saddling Abby's roan, working the cinchage with his right hand, favoring his ribs. Through the open barn doors, he saw the dust. He dropped the stirrup, 4 riders, moving at a slow, deliberate trot. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. They rode right down the center of Mercius crossing a single street. Silas stepped back into the shadows. He watched. At the head of the pack rode a man in a pristine gray suit coat and a bowler hat. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like an accountant. But the men behind him, rough-hewn men, wearing long dusters and carrying repeating rifles across their saddles, told a different story. Harlan Vance had arrived. The riders stopped in front of the general store. The town was dead quiet. Folks peeked out from behind burlap curtains. No one stepped onto the boardwalk, except Sheriff Amos Gentry. Amos stepped out of his office. He let his hand rest casually, near the heavy Colt strapped to his hip. He didn't unholster it, but he made sure Vance saw the gesture. "Mr. Vance," Amos called out. His voice was loud, echoing off the wooden storefronts. "You're a long way from the railhead." Harlan Vance smiled. It was a thin, cold expression, like a crack in a frozen pond. "Sheriff Gentry," Vance replied smoothly. He didn't dismount. "Progress waits for no man. The Continental Railroad is looking to finalize the survey lines through this valley, just doing some preliminary negotiations." "We ain't negotiating," Amos said flatly. "The town voted. Land stays in private hands." "Votes can change," Vance said. His eyes swept over the town. Cold, assessing, especially when folks realize the benefits of cooperation. He looked back at Amos. The smile vanished. "I'm looking for a man," Vance stated. His voice dropped the polite charade. "Big man. Goes by Silas Lockwood. Stole company property. I have reason to believe he might be hiding in your jurisdiction." Amos didn't flinch. "Haven't seen him. Is that a fact?" Vance's eyes narrowed, because a reliable source mentioned a stranger stumbling into town a few nights back, bleeding. A lot of drifters pass through, Amos said, holding his ground. If I see a man matching that description, I'll let the federal marshals know. They usually handle company thieves. It was a subtle threat. Amos was reminding Vance that Mercy's Crossing was still under the umbrella of federal law, not railroad muscle. Vance stared at the old sheriff for a long moment. Then, slowly, the cold smile returned. "Of course, Sheriff," Vance said. "We'll be camping by the creek. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." Vance tipped his hat. He spurred his horse, and the group moved on, riding slowly past the sheriff's office, heading toward the edge of town, toward Abby's homestead. Silas felt the blood freeze in his veins. He turned and ran. Every step felt like a hot iron pressing against his stitches, but he didn't stop. He sprinted from the barn toward the back door of the house. He burst into the kitchen. Abby was at the stove. She turned, startled by the noise. "He's here," Silas gasped, clutching his chest. "Vance! He's riding this way." Abby's face went pale, but she didn't panic. She immediately looked toward the hallway. "Lucy," Abby called out. The girl came running from her bedroom. "Go to the root cellar," Abby ordered. Her voice left no room for argument. "Take the lantern. Do not light it. Do not come up until I call your name. Understand?" Lucy looked terrified, but she nodded. She ran to the small trapdoor near the pantry, pulled it open, and vanished into the dark earth below. "You need to hide," Abby told Silas, turning back to him. "I'm not hiding," Silas growled. He reached for the Winchester leaning by the door. Abby grabbed the barrel of the rifle. Her grip was iron. "If you shoot him now, his men will burn this house down with all of us in it." Abby hissed. "This isn't a saloon fight, Silas. This is a siege. We play it smart." "He's coming for me," Silas argued. "He thinks you're dead or dying," Abby shot back. "If he sees you standing, he'll know I fixed you. He'll know I'm involved. Get in the back room. Now." Silas hated it. Every instinct screamed at him to stand and face the man who had ruined his life. But he looked at Abby. She was right. If he forced a gunfight here, Lucy would be caught in the crossfire. Silas let go of the rifle. He stepped into the back bedroom and pulled the door shut, leaving it cracked just an inch. Seconds later, the sound of hoofbeats filled the front yard. A heavy knock rattled the front door. Abby took a deep breath. She smoothed her apron. She walked to the door and opened it. Harlan Vance stood on her porch. His 3 men remained on horseback, fanning out across the yard. They were looking at the barn, the house, the perimeter. Professional thugs. "Mrs. Thatcher," Vance said, politely. He removed his bowler hat. "Mr. Vance," Abby replied. She didn't step aside to let him in. She stood perfectly centered in the doorframe. "Word travels fast on the prairie," Vance smiled. "I heard Mercy's Crossing has a rather unique medical practitioner. I patch up the hurt." Abby said plainly, "What do you want?" "I'm looking for a man," Vance said. His eyes scanned the room behind her. "He took something from me. He was badly hurt. A knife wound to the chest. A man with a wound like that would need an expert hand to survive." "I haven't seen a man with a knife wound," Abby said. Her voice was steady. Perfect pitch. Vance looked at her closely. He stepped forward, closing the distance. He towered over her, trying to use his physical size to intimidate. Abby didn't step back. Implicit value. A woman standing her ground against a powerful, aggressive man, refusing to yield her space. "It's a dangerous thing, Mrs. Thatcher," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. "Harboring a thief, especially for a widow. Accidents happen out here on the frontier." "Fire start," Tragic things. Abby's eyes turned to flint. Are you threatening my home, Mr. Vance? I'm offering advice, Vance smiled coldly. I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to negotiate. He took a step back, looking around the yard. Then, his eyes fell on a small wooden carving sitting on the porch rail. A little wooden horse. Silas had whittled it for Lucy 2 days ago. Vance picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. Cute, Vance noted. You have a child, Mrs. Thatcher. A little girl, I'm told. In the back room, Silas gripped the doorframe. His knuckles turned white. My daughter is none of your concern, Abby said. Her voice was ice. Oh, but she is, Vance said. He looked back at Abby. And in that moment, the polite mask slipped completely. His eyes were hollow, dead things. I hear she's about 14. Found near Abilene. Around the time a certain fire occurred. Abby, D.S. heart stopped. He knew. Somehow, through the Pinkerton network or pure malicious instinct, Vance had connected the dots. He had realized the orphan girl in Mercy's Crossing was the last surviving piece of his own bloodline. The bloodline he had tried to erase. Vance tossed the little wooden horse back onto the porch. I'm a wealthy man, Mrs. Thatcher, Vance said, his voice dripping with venom. I have connections, judges, orphanages. It would be a terrible shame if it was decided that a frontier widow, illegally practicing medicine, was deemed unfit to raise a child. It would be tragic if that child was placed in a state ward, far, far away. He leaned in close. Give me Silas Lockwood, Vance whispered, or I will take the girl, and you will never see her again. Abby stared at the monster on her porch. She didn't blink. She didn't cry. She planted her feet. A child is not a piece of property, Abby stated. Her words rang out clear and sharp. You cannot put a price tag on a human life, Harlan Vance. You cannot use a girl as a poker chip for your own greed. Her right to a home, to a mother, isn't something you can buy. Vance chuckled. It was a dry, awful sound. Rights are for people who can afford to defend them, Mrs. Thatcher, Vance said. He put his hat back on. I'll be camped by the creek. You have until tomorrow morning, at sunrise, to bring Lockwood to me. If he isn't there, I'll come for the girl. And the law won't stop me. Vance turned on his heel. He walked down the steps, mounted his horse, and rode out of the yard. His men followed. Abby stood on the porch, watching the dust settle. The door to the back room swung open. Silas stepped out. His face was a mask of pure concentrated fury. He had his heavy Colt revolver in his hand. He had retrieved it from the lockbox. I'm going to kill him, Silas snarled, moving toward the front door. I'll shoot him, right off his damn horse. Abby spun around. She grabbed Silas by the shirt collar and slammed him back against the wall. It jarred his ribs. He grunted in pain, dropping the gun to his side. You will not go out there and get yourself killed, Abby shouted. It was the first time she had raised her voice. If you die, there is no one left to stop him from taking Lucy. Is that what you want? To play the hero while a 14-year-old girl gets sold to an orphanage? Silas breathed heavily, staring at her. He's going to take her, Abby, Silas pleaded, his voice breaking. He has the money. He has the judges in his pocket. He's using the law to steal a human being. Abby let go of his shirt. She stepped back, her chest heaving. She looked at the trapdoor leading to the cellar. She looked at the blood-stained coat hanging on the chair. She looked at the man standing before her, a man who had finally chosen to stay and fight. He thinks we are weak, Abby said. Her voice dropped back to that terrifying, rhythmic calm. He thinks because I am a woman and you are wounded, that we will fold. She walked over to the table and picked up her Winchester. He is wrong, Abby said. She looked at Silas, her dark eyes burning with a brilliant, dangerous light. We aren't going to wait for sunrise, and we aren't going to shoot him in the street. Then what are we going to do? Silas asked. Abby racked the lever of the Winchester. A heavy brass shell clattered onto the pine floor. We are going to give Sheriff Gentry the evidence he needs to hang a rich man, Abby said. And if Vance tries to take my daughter, he'll find out exactly what kind of surgeon I am. Midnight. The house was pitch black. Abby had blown out the lanterns hours ago. Harlan Vance had men watching the property. She could feel them out there in the dark, waiting for a mistake, waiting for weakness. Silas was in the back room. He was on his knees. He had pried up a loose floorboard under the bed. He reached into the dusty hollow. His hand closed around a leather-bound ledger. He pulled it out. It was heavy, full of names, dates, and dollar amounts. Blood money. It was the master ledger for Unit 42. Silas had stolen it the night he ran. It held the proof of every farm burned, every man shot, and every bribe paid to federal judges by the Continental Railroad. It was the only reason Vance had hunted him down. Silas stood up. He moved too fast. His boot caught the edge of the rug. He twisted to catch his balance. A sickening tear echoed in his chest. Silas dropped the ledger. He fell against the wall, biting down on his sleeve to keep from screaming. The pain was blinding. White-hot and jagged. He felt the warm, wet rush of blood soaking through his bandages. The door opened. Abby stepped in. She didn't have a lamp, only a single stubby candle shielded by her hand. She saw him slumped against the wall. She saw the dark stain spreading across his white shirt. "You tore it," she whispered. "I got it," Silas gasped, kicking the leather ledger toward her. "The proof! It's all there." Abby didn't look at the book. She looked at the blood. "Get on the bed," she ordered. Silas dragged himself onto the mattress. He lay flat, his breathing ragged. Abby set the candle on the nightstand. The flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. It barely provided enough light to see. "I can't light the lamp," Abby said softly. "They'll see the light through the curtains. They'll know we're awake." "I know," Silas breathed. "Just tie it tight." Abby leaned over him. She unbuttoned his soaked shirt. She unwrapped the ruined bandages. The fresh stitches had popped. The wound was open again, angry and weeping. She took a clean cloth and pressed down hard. Silas groaned, his head throwing back. Abby held the pressure. She waited for the bleeding to slow. Her eyes adjusted to the dim candlelight. But her eyes weren't doing the work. Her hands were. She reached for her needle and thread. "I have to go deep to catch the muscle," Abby said. Her voice was a steady rhythm in the dark room. "It's going to hurt. Do it." Abby placed her left hand flat against his chest to steady the skin, her fingers spread wide. And then time stopped. Her index finger traced the ridge of a scar just below the fresh wound. It was thick, uneven, a diagonal line crossing from the collarbone toward the ribs. Abby froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. She closed her eyes. Suddenly, she wasn't in Texas. She was in Virginia. It was 1864. The smell of rain and mud filled her nose. The sound of artillery thundered in the distance. She was in the medical tent. The lantern had just died. She remembered the feeling of this exact scar. She remembered the desperate rushed cross-stitch she had used because she couldn't see. She remembered the angle of the blade that had cut the boy. She remembered the frantic beat of his heart under her palm as she traded a father's life for his. Abby opened her eyes. She looked down at Silas' chest in the flickering candlelight. Her hands found a scar that told the whole story. It was him, the nameless boy in the blue coat. Abby's hands began to tremble. The needle slipped from her fingers. It fell onto the blanket. Silas felt her stop. He felt her trembling. Abby? What is it? Abby slowly pulled her hand back. She looked at his face, the hard lines, the gray at his temples, the man he had become. Cold Harbor, she whispered. Silas frowned, his eyes hazy with pain. What? Cold Harbor, Virginia, 1864. Abby's voice was breaking. The iron walls she had built around her soul were shattering into dust. You had a bayonet wound, just missed the lung. The surgeon was gone. Silas stared at her. His heart pounded against his ribs. It was dark, Abby choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. The lamps were out. I had to stitch you in the dark. I used a diagonal cross-stitch. I tied the knots on the left side. Silas reached up. His trembling fingers brushed the old, raised scar on his chest. I never saw your face, Silas whispered. His voice was full of awe. I passed out from the pain. When I woke up, they told me the nurse who saved me was gone to another camp. I never knew her name. Abby covered her mouth. A sob tore from her throat. It was you, Silas said. I traded the Major's life for yours, Abby cried, the guilt and the grace of it crashing down on her all at once. I carried his death every single day. I thought I sinned. I thought I made the wrong choice. Silas reached out. He grabbed her hand. His grip was fiercely strong. Look at me, Silas commanded softly. Abby looked at him through her tears. You didn't sin, Silas said. You saved my life. And because you saved my life then, I am here to save yours now. The absolute poetry of it hung in the small, candlelit room. It was the universe balancing its scales. Implicit value, a profound demonstration of how human compassion ripples through time. Doing the right thing, saving a life without prejudice, eventually returned to save her own family. Abby took a deep, shuddering breath. She wiped her eyes. She picked up the needle. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly still. Hold your breath, she said. She stitched him, swiftly, perfectly. When she was done, she wrapped him tight. She stood up and picked up the leather ledger from the floor. She looked at the book. Then she looked at Silas. Vance wants a fight, Abby said, her voice finding its iron rhythm once more. He expects you to ride out with a gun. He expects to kill you in the street, claim self-defense, and take my daughter. That's how he operates, Silas agreed, sitting up slowly. But we aren't going to play his game, Abby said. She tapped the ledger. A gunfight only proves who shoots faster. It doesn't prove who is right. True justice isn't found in a pool of blood, Silas. It's found in the truth. We use the law. We use this. Silas nodded. He understood. An hour before dawn, they moved. They didn't saddle horses. They slipped out the back door, staying in the deep shadows of the barn. They moved through the tall prairie grass behind the town, avoiding the main street entirely. They walked to the back door of the sheriff's office. Amos Gentry was awake. He was sitting at his desk, drinking stale coffee, his shotgun resting across his lap. Abby knocked. 3 sharp taps. Amos opened the back door. He saw Abby. Then he saw the big man standing behind her, favoring his left side. Amos, Abby said, this is Silas Lockwood. Amos didn't raise his shotgun. He just stepped aside. Get in here before Vance's pickets see you. They stepped into the office. Abby set the heavy leather ledger on the sheriff's desk. What's this? Amos asked. That, Silas said, leaning heavily against the wall, is the rope that's going to hang Harlan Vance, and every federal judge he bought. Amos opened the book. He flipped through the pages. His eyes widened. It was a meticulous record of extortion, murder, and theft, all tied directly to the Continental Railroad. Vance gave me until sunrise, Abby said to the sheriff. He said if I didn't hand Silas over, he was going to take Lucy. He was going to use the courts to claim she's an orphan. Amos slammed the ledger shut. His jaw tightened. He's going to use the law to steal a child? Amos growled. He thinks he owns the law, Silas said, because men like him believe money buys the right to step on anyone beneath them. Amos looked at Silas. The law ain't a tool for the rich to grind down the poor. Not in my town. The law is a shield for the folks who can't hold one themselves. Amos picked up his badge from the desk. He pinned it to his vest. He grabbed a telegraph form and a pencil. I'm wiring the U.S. Marshals in Dallas, Amos said. With this ledger, they'll have an arrest warrant cut before breakfast. He looked at Abby and Silas. Sun's coming up, Amos said. He racked his shotgun. Let's go show Mr. Vance that progress is canceled. Dawn broke over Mercy S. Crossing. Harlan Vance rode down Main Street at exactly 6 o'clock. His 3 men flanked him. They looked confident. They expected a terrified widow. They expected a bleeding fugitive. They didn't expect the entire town. Amos Gentry stood in the center of the dirt road. Behind him stood Eli, the farmhand with the stitched arm, holding a rifle. Next to Eli stood the blacksmith, carrying a scattergun. 10 other men, ordinary folks who minded their own business, stood shoulder to shoulder. They weren't looking for a shootout. They were forming a wall. Abby stood on the boardwalk outside the general store. Silas stood right beside her. Vance pulled his horse up short. His eyes darted over the armed crowd, finally landing on Silas. Lockwood, Vance sneered. You look terrible. Should have stayed dead. I tried, Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, but I found a good doctor. Vance looked at Amos. Sheriff, you're interfering with railroad business. That man is a thief. Hand him over. Amos stepped forward. He held up a piece of yellow telegraph paper. I got a wire from the U.S. Marshals in Dallas 10 minutes ago, Vance, Amos called out. They reviewed the telegram I sent them, the one detailing a certain ledger found in Mr. Lockwood's possession. Vance's face lost its color. The arrogant smile vanished. The Marshals are boarding a train right now. Amos continued. They hold a federal warrant for your arrest. Extortion. Bribery. Murder. Vance's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. Silas didn't reach for his gun. He just stared Vance down. Draw it, Harlan, Silas said. Give these folks a reason. But you won't, because bullies only fight when they hold all the cards. You've got nothing left. Vance looked at the rifles pointed at him. He looked at his 3 hired men. They were thugs, not martyrs. They slowly raised their hands, backing their horses away. Vance was beaten, not by a faster gun, but by a community that refused to be bullied and a truth he couldn't bury. Climb down, Vance, Amos ordered. You're spending the next few weeks in my jail. Vance dismounted. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Abby. Complete, venomous hatred. Abby looked right back. She didn't shrink. She had won. 3 weeks passed. The dust settled. The Continental Railroad, desperate to avoid a federal scandal, rerouted their line 30 miles north. Mercy's Crossing kept its land. Harlan Vance was on his way to a federal penitentiary. Silas didn't leave. His wound was a pale pink line now. He was chopping wood in the yard, using both hands. The crisp November air felt good in his lungs. He heard footsteps on the boardwalk. He walked around to the front of the house. Doc Josiah was standing outside the clinic next door. The old doctor had a hammer in his hand. He was nailing a new wooden sign to the post. Silas walked over. Abby was already standing there, holding Lucy's hand. Josiah stepped back. He wiped his brow. The sign read, Dr. Josiah Barton and Dr. Abigail Thatcher, medicine and surgery. Abby stared at the wooden board. The word doctor sat right in front of her name. It was illegal in half the country. It was frowned upon everywhere else. Josiah turned to the small crowd that had gathered. He pointed at Abby. "For too long, I let pride get in the way of what's right," the old doctor said loudly. "This town survived because of her hands. It's about damn time we honor the person saving our lives, whether those hands wear a skirt or trousers. Competence has no gender." The town clapped. Eli tipped his hat. Amos smiled from the porch of the jail. Abby touched her mouth, overwhelmed. Silas stepped up behind her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a silent pillar of support. Later that evening, the house was quiet. Lucy was in the barn, brushing her Mustang. Silas walked in. He leaned against the stall door. "He's looking good, Lucy," Silas said. Lucy kept brushing. "Mama says a horse remembers the hand that feeds it, not the hand that hit it. Your mama is a wise woman." Lucy stopped. She looked at Silas. "Am I bad because of who my grandfather is?" Implicit value. Silas knelt down. He looked the 14-year-old girl in the eye, treating her with the absolute respect of an equal. "Listen to me, Lucy," Silas said softly. "You are exactly who you choose to be. Blood is just water and iron. It doesn't write your story. Love writes your story. And your mother loves you more than anything in this world. That makes you a Thatcher. Nothing else matters." Lucy smiled, a real, bright smile. She went back to brushing the horse. Silas walked out of the barn. He went to the back porch. Abby was sitting on the wooden steps. She had a cup of tea in her hands. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in violent shades of purple and gold. Silas sat down next to her. They didn't speak for a long time. They just watched the horizon. "You're healed," Abby said quietly. She didn't look at him. "Stitches are out. Infection is gone." "I am," Silas agreed. "You don't owe me anything, Silas," Abby said. Her voice was rhythmic, steady. "The debt is paid. You saved this town. You saved Lucy. You're a free man." Silas looked down at his hands. "I know." "So," Abby said, finally turning to look at him. Her dark eyes searched his face. "Why is your saddle still in my barn?" Silas met her gaze. "Because I'm done running," Silas said. "I spent my whole life looking for something worth fighting for. Something real. I found it here." He reached out. He gently took the teacup from her hands and set it on the porch. He took her calloused, working hands in his own. "I don't stay out of obligation, Abigail," Silas said, his voice a low, steady promise. "I stay because I choose to, because a man would be a fool to walk away from the only light he's ever known in the dark." Abby looked at their joined hands. For 15 years, her hands had fought. They had stitched torn flesh. They had held rifles. They had scrubbed blood from the floorboards. They had carried the weight of a town and the ghost of a dead husband. But sitting here, on the porch, holding the hands of a man she had saved twice, once in a war, and once in peace, Abby finally let her guard down. She let her hands rest. She leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. She could feel the steady beat of his heart. She could feel the faint, uneven ridge of the scar beneath his shirt. It wasn't a mark of pain anymore. It wasn't a reminder of a sin. It was a map, and it had finally led them both home. The author does not encourage or promote dangerous actions, illegal behavior, discrimination, or harmful conduct depicted in this story. Any conflicts, confrontations, or controversial themes shown are fictional elements designed to support the dramatic structure of the narrative.
And there it is. A woman finally letting her hands rest. Not because she is weak, not because someone came to rescue her, but because After 15 years of stitching the world back together, she found someone willing to sit beside her in the dark and hold the lantern steady while she healed herself. That is the heartbeat of this story, and it beats in every single scene, from the first desperate thud against a midnight door to a wooden sign nailed above a clinic that finally said the word doctor in front of a woman's name. This is a story about what we owe each other. And it begins with the most radical idea of all, that a person's right to care and to be cared for has absolutely nothing to do with the labels the world pins to their chest. Abby Thatcher didn't ask what kind of man was bleeding on her floor. She didn't ask if he was worth saving. She asked if he could stand. Because a healer doesn't get to choose who deserves a tomorrow. That principle, the absolute, unwavering equality of human suffering, is the spine of everything that follows. It is a truth so simple it should need no defense, and yet in every era, in every town, in every system built by powerful men to protect powerful men, it is the most dangerous idea alive. Blood runs the same color in a saint as it does in a sinner. When Abby said those words to her daughter in the dark, she wasn't just teaching medicine. She was teaching the only moral law that truly matters. And then there is the weight of silence. Silas Lockwood did not pull the trigger on Nathan Thatcher, but he packed his saddlebag and rode north while men he knew went south to commit murder. He told himself he had quit. He told himself he was done. But quitting evil is not the same as stopping it. Turning away from an injustice you had the power to prevent is not neutrality. It is participation. He carried that truth for 7 years, and it hollowed him out from the inside, because guilt without action is just another form of cowardice, wearing a cleaner coat. What finally broke the weight was not absolution. Abby never gave him that. What broke it was the decision to stop running and stand. A man's worth isn't decided by his worst mistake. It's decided by what he does next. That is not a comfortable truth. It demands something from you. But it is the only truth that leaves room for a future. And what about the scar? The greatest revelation of this story is not a gunfight, not a courtroom, not even a ledger full of blood money laid on a sheriff's desk. It is a woman's fingers moving through darkness, over a wound she has known for 15 years, suddenly recognizing the map of her own hands. The boy in the blue coat. The impossible choice at Cold Harbor. The guilt she had carried. The sin she believed she had committed. The trade she was certain had made her monstrous. All of it came rushing back in the dark of that bedroom. And what it revealed was not judgment. It was grace. The compassion she had given a nameless stranger on a battlefield, without knowing who he was, without any hope of reward, had traveled 15 years across a broken country, and returned to stand between her and the man who wanted to take everything she loved. That is not a coincidence. That is a law. The universe keeps its accounts. Every act of genuine human decency plants a seed in ground you cannot see, in soil you will never tend, in a season you may not live to witness. You do not do the right thing because it will be rewarded. You do the right thing because the alternative is becoming the very darkness you are trying to survive. And finally, to Lucy, a 14-year-old girl asking in a quiet barn if she was bad because of the blood she carried. That question is not hers alone. It belongs to every child ever made to feel like an inheritance of shame. Every person told they were born wrong, born guilty, born into a debt they never signed for. The answer Silas gave her in that barn is the answer this story gives to everyone who has ever carried someone else's sin on their shoulders. You are exactly who you choose to be. Blood is just water.